It's such a privilege to have you both here, Dr. Hare and Dr. Machery. This forum, as our team has prepared, is predicated on the observation that belief in God or some supernatural being is widespread throughout human history. And various explanations for this phenomenon abound, from theology to neuroscience to psychiatry. So could you both tell us a bit about your background as well as your approach to the question, did humans create God?
I go first?
Yes, go ahead.
So my background, I grew up in a family that went to church. And then I gave it all up when I was an adolescent, because I went to what was supposed to be a Christian school. And I thought that the way the people were behaving didn't fit the way they were preaching. And I went to India because the Beatles did. You're too young for the Beatles. They went to India to study with a guru. And I did that. I went and apprenticed myself to a guru. And I learned how to meditate. And then I met the Christians that I respected. And I met some more when I went up as an undergraduate. And so I found my faith again. So I want to say three things about what God does in relation to morality that I value. The first is that we need some way to hold happiness and being a good person together. And this is an argument from Immanuel Kant, the philosopher. I spent 50 years studying Kant. So it's God, Kant thinks, who holds happiness and duty or morality together. Secondly, we seem to have a natural tendency to prefer ourselves and our own interest to what morality requires. And God helps us reverse that ranking. And then the third thing is God gives us a justification. Why should we be moral? It's very difficult sometimes to be morally good. And we need some answer to the question, why should we? And God gives us an answer to that question.
So interestingly, my life history somewhat mirrors, at least for part of it, John's life history. I too was raised as a believer. I was a Catholic when I was young, and I too lost faith. I lost faith for a somewhat different reason. I lost faith because of what philosophers call the problem of evil. You know, you look around you, and I was a young man at the time, it was fairly unsophisticated. You look around you, you see bad things happening, and you see good people suffering, and you see bad people being very successful in life. We see that all the time. If there is a God, and if God is omnipotent, if God can do whatever it wants, and if God is good, how come there is so much pain, so much suffering of good people around me? You know, that's a very traditional question. It's a century-old worry about religion. Now, I stumbled by accident, so to speak, upon this philosophical issue when I was a young man. And I was so troubled, deeply, deeply troubled by that question, that I just stopped believing, literally from one day to the next. For me, it was just a revelation. Now I know, at the time I didn't know, but now I know that some of the greatest minds have written books and books and books. So it's a very subtle question, and there's a very long history of thinking about that problem. But for me, it was a reason to stop being, to lose faith. And I didn't find it back. I've remained a non-believer since then. I do not miss religion. I actually, at this point in my life, I don't have much religious striving. And I do still believe that the problem of evil, the fact that there's some suffering in the world, is still a genuine challenge for religion. So there's an overlap and also interesting contrast between our two perspectives here. I do agree with some of the ideas that John described earlier, but I would put them slightly differently. So John, for example, mentioned the fact that God can provide a reason not to be egoistic, not to behave in an egoistic manner. It can also give us an answer to the question, why should it be moral? I think there's a lot of truth in that. But I, as a non-believer, interpret the answer slightly differently. It's not God that plays a role. It's a belief in God. What we need in a society is people believing in God, or possibly people believing in God might help some people to behave in an altruistic manner, might give for some people a motivation. And this explains maybe why the belief is God is so common. So I would replace, in a sense, God in John's statement with a belief in God and try to use these ideas to explain why across so many societies throughout history, the belief in God is actually quite common.
Thank you both so much for your just sharing your backgrounds in religion and also just talking more about this. And yeah, I wanted to ask more about the role that religion plays in our lives, because I sense that theme between both of your answers. So Dr. John Hare, could you talk more about, kind of expand on your 3 points and talk about how that might be helpful for a society or important for humanity?
Yes. So my wife of 45 years died about 3 years ago of cancer. And we had 3 years before that, and the prognosis went up and down. It was one of the hardest things, as we never knew what the prognosis really was. But my wife said to me, I don't know whether I'm going to live or die, but I do know that I'm in God's hands. And that gave her peace. And then when she died, at first I was just beside myself and I wasn't sure whether I could go on at all. But over the last couple of years, I've started to sense the presence of God with me. And that too has given me peace.
Thank you.
So I'd like to, in some way, come back to the question you asked us earlier, and that was a little bit on the screen. Did human beings create God? And the answer I want to give is yes, human beings did create God. And I want to tell you why, and that's going to be relating to some of the things that John said, why I believe that the answer is yes. There are negative reasons why I believe that that human beings created gods. The first type of reason is I find the arguments for the transcendence of God to be uncompelling, to be unconvincing. I doubt that we could, by just reasoning, show that gods are real. Philosophers have tried for centuries to demonstrate that gods are real. And while the arguments are very sophisticated, it's plausible that they all fail. So we can't demonstrate by just reason that there is a God. We could appeal to revelation, and indeed many believers believe that God, the presence of God, was revealed to humanity. It's part of the Christian tradition, it's part of the Muslim tradition, it's part of the Jewish tradition, for example. It's a bit puzzling because if our reasons to believe that there is a God comes from revelation, why are all the societies in the world, what happened to them? Why do people in very different society also have gods? How does that really make sense? It seems that God was not revealed to them, but they somehow independently came to be believing in God. So revelation really does not explain the universality of our belief in God. And then the last one, that's how I'm going to be relating to what John said, is the experience of God. Some people, and indeed John mentioned himself, have a genuine experience of the divine. It's a very important aspect of religion. But I think it's also important to take into the fact that many people, including me, do not have the experience of God, do not, I don't experience God in my life. I don't miss it, I don't relate to it, I don't strive for it. And so the question then is, why should we take that this experience of God should be taken as face value? It might be a misleading experience. Many experiences are actually misleading. They don't, they pretend that to show us something, but they're not really telling us. So here's the point, that all the reasons to believe in God strike me as unconvincing. And then there's a positive reason why I give the answer I gave earlier to the question, did human beings create God? The positive reason is that I believe that science gives us a good understanding of the sources and the origins of the belief in God. I think when we look at psychology, anthropology, evolutionary biology, we can get not a detailed explanation, but a sketch of an explanation for why there is all over the world a belief in God. So that's a positive reason, right? We can recognize, we can explain why there is a belief in God.
Thank you so much. So you mentioned the experience of God and how some people have it or some people do not. I'm curious if we can have a discussion, maybe Dr. Hare, about what you think about experiences of God or miracles or claims of experiencing the divine and how that relates to kind of the universality of religion.
Yes, so there's a lot to say about that. I want to respond first, though, to the thought that we might replace the usefulness of God with usefulness of belief in God. Some figures extrapolating now from the progress of the world's great religions have said by 2050 it'll be about 80% of the world's population. Already it was 73% 10 years ago. We have to take that with a pinch of salt because what's meant by believing in a religion is quite complicated. Nonetheless, if we're going to say that what's important isn't God, but belief in God, we're saying that massive numbers of people, hundreds of millions of people over the ages have been self-deceived. And that's a radical thing to say, not something I want to say. So what else to say about why it's not universal? I don't think we should expect everybody to have experiences of God. My own belief is God would like to everybody to, but people resist. They say no. And we have that freedom. So I'm not surprised that some people do have that experience and some people don't.
Dr. Machery, do you?
Yes,
thoughts?
yes, absolutely. So I just think John is right to highlight the idea that there's something quite radical to say that 5 billion of human beings have false beliefs. This is quite a stunning claim to make. I think John is really quite right to put his fingers right there. I mean, this is maybe it can even come across as being arrogant, right? You're just telling everyone that they have false beliefs. It is actually a very, very good point. It should be acknowledged. On the other hand, we do all have false beliefs about a lot of different things. Just to give you one example, until the early 20th century, we believed that simultaneity was absolute. We've known since Einstein that this is not the case. Simultaneity is always relative to a frame. Oh, an incredible aspect of our experience and a very common belief about the world that we all seem to be sharing turn out to be false. Most people who are not educated in modern physics or 20th century physics might not even be aware of this kind of idea. And it's not particularly arrogant to just say that many of us, including me, all the time harbor beliefs that we learn are or might be misguided. It is stunning, I believe, but in fact not unusual. And I don't think really at the end of the day arrogant, which I think something I would take quite as a genuine concern. The suggestions as it's an arrogant view to have. Now, and I concerning the second point about experience, I agree totally with what John said. From his perspective, there's no reason to expect everyone to have the experience of the divine. I think that's absolutely true. It's definitely not an objection to John that not everyone have an experience of the divine. From my point of view, it does explain to you why I do not find the experience of the divine compelling, because I do not have that experience, and also because I feel that some experiences are misleading, and I worry that the experience of the divine might be misleading too. So, yeah.
Could I just respond to that? About Einstein. So I agree, there are lots of things that we believe falsely. For centuries and centuries and centuries, people believed that the sun went round the earth, for example. And indeed, in many parts of the world, most people still do think that. But so I study ancient philosophy, and Aristotle has a principle. He says, what seems to all, this we should say is, unless we can show why people have gone wrong. So he's willing to disagree with common opinion, but only if he can show why it went wrong and how it went wrong. And I think that's a good principle, and it doesn't, in my view, work for the case of belief in God.
So I actually, I'm not sure. I totally agree with the principle that I suspect I'm more skeptical of common sense than you are, than Aristotle would be. If you know Aristotle always starts his philosophizing by collecting opinions, common opinions. This is the way he starts thinking about a given topic, and that is reflected in the maxim that John summarized here. I'm probably more skeptical of the value of common sense to deal with scientific and philosophical matters. But bracketing that question, I think that we're touching at a point where there might be an interesting, one of the many points where there might be an interesting difference between us is I probably believe that we have reasonable explanations for why human beings believe in God that come from science. I suspect John is skeptical that these explanations are on the right track or even compelling. So I do believe that psychology has given us a sketch of an explanation why so many people feel that there is a divine around them, there is God. I do believe that evolutionary biology tells us why a belief in God can have a given function and can play a role in societies. I suspect John is quite skeptical of these explanations. And I think that's a place where there seems to be like a red line here between two different ways of thinking about religion.
Thank you both so much. And I think from what you both have said, this idea of religion being brought up in many different areas and it making sense that people have religion in their societies does bring up the question of, does religion impact morality? And I know both of you have extensive studies on morality. You know, Dr. Machery, your work in moral psychology and the ethical significance of cognition, and Dr. Hare, you've written about the question of goodness in your book, The Moral Gap, and asking the question, why bother being good? And so when it comes to approaching the question of morality, how do you define good? Is God necessary for goodness to exist? Or is goodness something that religion provides rather than a divine being?
Okay, I'll start this one. But I'll start by not answering the question. I apologize. I'll start by giving you a little bit of background about my way of thinking about morality. And I've got two hats when I'm thinking about morality. I've got a philosophical hat, and I've got a more empirical hat, because I also do some empirical work. As a philosopher, I'm mostly interested in what it is we mean when we say things like, it's wrong to lie, you should not lie, you should not kill. What do we mean when we use these kind of statements? I'm also interested in the justification that we have for holding this view. Are we ever justified in believing that it's wrong to lie? It's a part of philosophy that philosophers call metaethics. This is really where my interests lie. And in this area of philosophy, I have a very somewhat unusual view called norm expressivism. So let me explain to you, it's a bit of jargon. Let me explain to you what that means. It means that when I say it is wrong to lie, I'm not describing the world around me. It's very different from, lying is wrong. I'm not describing the world. It's very different from saying this jacket is gray, where I'm describing the jacket, right? When I say lying is wrong, what I'm really telling you is that I'm expressing a negative attitude toward lying, and I'm recommending that you also have a similar attitude. So I'm prescribing a given way of relating to lying. So that's my view. In fact, we believe we are saying some things about the world when we're saying lying is wrong, that there's wrongness in the world, that we can learn about wrongness, but it's an illusion. What there really is attitudes that people have with respect to various actions, such as lying. And sometimes we are confusing lying is wrong with statements such as my jacket is gray. An interesting wrinkle, if you're a norm expressivist, is that you can be a relativist. You can think that attitudes vary across cultures, for example, and you can find that totally okay, right? You can find that it's totally fine if the norms people are committed to vary in different cultures, in different settings, and so on and so forth. On this view, being good is not a matter of objective fact, right? There's no objective things to learn about the world, about goodness. Goodness is defined by the attitude that some group of people happen to have with respect to some action, all right? So that's my philosophical hat. I suspect very different from John's philosophical hat, but we're going to hear about that. I also have an empirical hat, where I do some empirical work on morality. And one of the things I'm interested in, that ties a little bit with my philosophical perspective, is how do we distinguish morality from other things in life? You know, so for example, you say, it's wrong to jaywalk. Well, teach my daughter, I tell her, you should look right and left before crossing a street. When I was a kid, as you can hear, I'm French, right? I guess you've all got that. And if you know a bit French for a very long time, French people are sticklers for rules. They love etiquette. It's very important to behave properly, right? So when I was a child, my mother was telling me, you ought to put your two hands around the table when we're eating and when you're not putting food in your mouth. It's very wrong not to have your hands on your knees. Now, there's all these statements we make, right? What do they have in common? They're all normative. They use words such as should, ought, right, wrong, right? One question that interests me is that, is there anything specific about morality among these statements? Is there something that distinguishes it is wrong to lie from you ought not to jaywalk, from you ought to put your hands around the table? These are not moral statements, I guess you agree. They're etiquette statements, they're conventional statements, right? But what distinguishes all these kinds of statements? And in some empirical work I've done, I've tried to provide evidence that in many cultures around the world, morality is not distinguished from these other statements. You can't really identify anything like a moral statement that differs from other types of statement, which has led me to the view that moral statement as moral are in fact an invention of a given culture or culture, and it's not a universal aspect of the human mind. And that ties a little bit with my philosophical views, because what really matters is not so much morality, it's the expression of your norms, what you believe you ought to do.
Yes, I'm delighted that you're a norm expressivist. My father actually invented norm expressivism.
Indeed. So I didn't know he was your father, yes. But indeed I knew. This is pretty amazing.
so I'm very familiar with this discussion. Arrim Hare, my father, if asked what makes moral norms different from other norms, like etiquette, he would say, like other norms, they're prescriptive and universalizable, but unlike the other norms, they're overriding. So that's what makes moral norms different from the other norms. And then we have to specify just what overriding means. I myself disagree with my father on the question of whether norms are real, whether there is something objective in the world that our moral judgments express. So I'm what I call a prescriptive realist. So you can combine the view that we are prescribing when we make a moral judgment with the view that there is something actually there that we are trying to express. That's enough.
I'll confess, I'm in awe at this one. Yeah.
Well, this is so interesting about just the difference between morality and etiquette. And could you both kind of give examples of, I know you already shared the etiquette of French culture, but ways in which perhaps morality or things we consider moral concepts override or not override etiquette? Yeah.
Yes, so the rules in my family were you had to keep your hands off the table unless you were an uncle or aunt, when you could put your hands on the table. And if you were a great uncle or great aunt, you could put your feet on the table. Why is morality overriding? Well, if you have to judge whether, let's say, an aesthetic norm, my father's example was, you shouldn't put magenta cushions on an orange sofa. but your aunt who gave you the cushion is coming and cares very much. You override the aesthetic preference for the sake of the moral one. And the claim that morality overrides is that that's usually the case. Not, I think, always, but usually.
Then perhaps we can go back to the question, is God necessary for goodness to exist? And I think that is kind of a loaded question, in that, is morality above humans or below humans? And I'm curious what you both have to say about that.
So as a non-believer, I will tell you, unsurprisingly, that the answer is no, that you can be a good person, you can strive to be a good person, even if there is no God. I would hope so, because I believe there's no God and I'm striving to be a good person. So I hope I'm not completely deluded on this point. For me, bracketing a little bit my norm-expressivism for a minute, let's suppose that you and I, which is quite likely, I suspect, agree by and large on many things that it means to be a good person. Right? We live in the same culture, we have overlapping backgrounds, not the same, of course, but there's probably a lot of agreement between us on what it means to be a good person. So how could you become a good person? Would a belief in God, or would God be necessary for striving to be a good person? I do believe that, and I suspect John will agree about that character is a very important aspect for being a good person. You know, Aristotle, of course, thought a lot about character as an important dimension of goodness. Another aspect, and I'm not sure that John would agree about that, is your environment. So I do believe that to be a good person, you need to be in the right environment. While I believe that character matters, I also believe that character cannot override the situations we happen to be thrown in. And often if people with the right character might be led to act wrongly because of the situations we're in. And I think that matters extremely, because we tend to focus on what's inside the character while forgetting the fact that we are embedded in a social environment. And that often the way to promote goodness is less to work on ourselves than to work in the environments we're in, to engineer good environment where people can actually fulfill their promises rather than just relying on who they are. Also, sometimes it means we should move environment rather to try to change the environment we're in. We should just look for environment in which we can actually be successful. And the last thing about environments, something that matters a lot for my way of thinking about life, is luck. It's sadly often a matter of luck whether we are in the right environment. So whether we're going to end up being a good person is often just a matter of luck, where we're lucky to be in the right environment that has allowed us to act in the right way. And I think that's an interesting puzzle if you are a moral philosopher. One that's not new, obviously. Philosophers have written a lot about that question. But if you haven't thought about it, think about how luck might matter in making you a good or a bad person, and how little maybe depends on what you're responsible for, what you have control over.
Yes. So there are a number of points there. Luck. So I told you I've done a lot of work on Immanuel Kant. I think he's the most important philosopher of the modern age. He responds to this point about luck by saying that your circumstances never dictate what kind of person you are. we always have the freedom to respond well to bad circumstances. And he thinks that actually morality requires us to think of each other that way. The way he puts it is, morality requires each of us to think of each other person as capable of virtue. So he acknowledges that there are lots of good people, not just striving to be good, but actually good, who don't believe in God. His central example is Spinoza, which might be unfair to Spinoza. but he thought of Spinoza as a famously good person, but somebody who didn't believe in God. So he's not saying you have to be a believer in order to be morally good. What he's saying is, this is his phrase, it's rationally unstable to combine these two things, that is, unbelief and the attempt to lead a morally good life. And it's rationally unstable because of those three reasons that I started with at the very beginning of this discussion.
I do have a question about that, because the 2 bottom points were we often prefer ourselves over good, and then there's also the question of why should we be good. Could you expand more on those points?
Yes. So here's Kant again. He says we're born with both the predisposition to good and the propensity to evil. Both of those are innate. But there's a difference between them, he says. The predisposition to good is essential to us. And if we lost it, we wouldn't, in fact, be human any longer. The propensity to evil is something we can lose. And in fact, hopefully some of us do lose it. So the propensity to evil is the propensity to put our own happiness above everything else, including our moral duty. So we'll only do what we think is the right thing to do if we think it'll make us happy. And Kant thinks we're born with that. But it can be overcome. It has to be possible to overcome because we ought to overcome it. And Kant has the principle, ought implies can. If it's the case that we ought to do it, then it must be the case that we can do it. It's wrong to hold people accountable to standards which they are unable to meet. So it must be possible, but it doesn't seem to be possible by our own devices. Because to overcome it by our own devices would require that we weren't already within radical evil, which he thinks we are. So that's why he says we need God. We need divine assistance to help us overcome this tendency. That's the second one. And then the third one, justification. We need justification because morality is very difficult. So let me just give you two examples of that. One is morality requires us to love our enemies. That's almost impossible. And then secondly, this is from Peter Singer, who was my father's student. But he says we have an obligation to help, use our resources to help those who are starving in the rest of the world. And that requires us to reduce our own standard of living. And he actually has done that. I mean, he's somebody who does practice what he preaches. But it's very difficult. And my point is, if we're going to do it, we need some justification for doing it in those cases where it seems to conflict with all of our inclinations.
So I'll follow up. I think that's, of course, extremely interesting. I want to point out the fact that Kant's claims rest on what Kant himself called, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, an anthropology, right? He's making claim about human nature, namely the incredible power of our egoistic tendencies, namely, and so on and so forth. These are empirical claims. These claims about who we are. They're not philosophical claims. They're not metaphysical claims. They're claims that anthropology, evolutionary biology, psychology can validate or invalidate. So, for example, when it comes to human being, well, of course, Kant does recognize that there is both good and bad in us, so to speak. One might think that, in fact, there's much more good than bad in us. One might think that a dominant, well, of course, we can sometimes prefer our own interests to other people. Very often, we do, without much difficulty, the exact opposite. That actually, being good comes very easily to most of us, right? And I do think that's a very different anthropology about the nature about human nature. One that, if we take seriously, somewhat undermines the kind of consideration that Kant puts forward. Another point also I wanted to make is, John is quite right to say it's extremely hard to do what Peter Singer says. It's extremely hard to love your enemies. And indeed, it's very hard to be a moral saint. But I think it's very easy to be a morally good person. You know, moral saints are very rare. In fact, moral saints are not necessarily the people I want to hang out with. You know, I think there's a lot of problematic things with moral saints. In fact, most of us are actually, on our everyday dealing, really good people. We don't go around kicking one another. We don't go around stealing one another. We don't go around lying to one another. We sometimes lie. We feel bad about it. We sometimes might pocket the change or might not give it back. We feel bad about it. But in most of our dealings, we are actually good people. So everyday morality is actually widespread and quite easy. I think it's a mistake to just focus on moral sainthood of the Peter Singer version. Give pretty much all your income to charities. You can do that if you want, it's great. But I think this is not capturing the way we are actually good on an everyday basis. And I think when you have a different anthropology, the need for God is quite lessened.
Dr. Machery, I'm very curious on that point, that you say that morality comes very naturally to most people, or goodness. You mentioned before that there is a big part of luck in how we were brought up, in how we define good in our lives. So how would you come to terms with the luck factor in the ease of being good?
That's a very good question. The two are, of course, compatible. If you're unlucky, and if you were unlucky, and if you were born in the 1920s in Germany, to use a classical philosophical example, you might have grown up being an anti-Semitic Nazi. And what would come easily to you or to me would then be hatred of millions of Europeans, leading you to behave in an appalling manner, right? In that case, luck would have led you to easily do the things that are wrong. It turns out that by luck, we're not, many of us are not in this kind of environment. And so what comes easily to us is actually somewhat different from what would come easily to us in this environment. Which is why I think paying attention to the environment we live in, as a social structure, what is valued around us, engineering better environment, more in line, and choosing the environment we live is extremely important.
Yes, I think maybe we just have a fundamental disagreement about how good we are. To me, it seems that it's self-congratulatory to think that we're all good, basically good people. We all have good in us, that is true. But if the moral standard is, to put this in Kant's terms now, we have to share the ends of the people who are affected by what we do. We have to make them our own ends. Then we're failing by that standard most of the time. And we don't have to be saints in order to have those standards. I think they're in the culture. And I think we are, in fact, most of us aware of the fact, deep down, that we're not meeting those standards.
So earlier we met an interesting line was that two of us disagree about explaining a belief in God and the place of science. And I think John is right here. We meet another point where there's maybe a source of a deep disagreement is whether or not how difficult it is to behave in a moral manner. John is more pessimistic in this way, as was Kant. And I believe I'm more optimistic, and I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
So until now, we've been talking about very high-level concepts of God and goodness, and for our audience of college students who maybe don't think about this in our daily lives, or it's difficult to relate to those abstractions, could you tell us how you or students could attend to the good in our lives? In other words, what are the stakes for believing either humans created God or God created humans?
Yeah, I gave a couple of examples at the very beginning from my wife and myself of what difference it makes in practice, whether you believe. But I could give lots more such examples, and I'll just give one. I used to work for the House Foreign Affairs Committee in Washington. This was some years ago. And the staff, both in the House and the Senate, both Republicans and Democrats, some of us met every week or every other week. We were Christians. And we met to pray for America. Now, whether they're still doing that, I don't know. I sort of doubt it. It's become more and more difficult. Polarization has increased. But the idea that we are in submission to an authority over the president or the government, that's an idea that has implications for how we behave. That our final authority isn't a temporal authority at all.
So interestingly, my response to your question will somewhat overlap with John's, but from a very different angle, of course. One thing that the kind of perspective I have on morality and religion, putting science first and trying to understand the nature of moral statements and why people are committed to morality and why people believe in God, has led me to valuing the role of tolerance. It gave me a deep appreciation for diversity in moral outlooks, in the fact that people differ in what they value, in the fact that great differences, and in accepting those differences. In fact, I do believe that this tolerance is central to the kind of naturalistic scientific perspective I have on the world. That you understand that humans differ. You understand that they differ for sometimes contingent reasons. You understand that the history has shaped who we are, and different histories have made other people different and would have made ourselves different. And I think that can only lead you to accept that your perspective on what you ought to do, what is valuable, what is the right way of life, is only one of many. And you should be willing to actually accept and tolerate very different ways of living in the world. So I think that's, for me, the lessons from this attempt to scientifically understand morality and religion. The tolerance is really central in the way we relate to one another. And it does touch on the point of polarization, because polarization, in fact, is almost by definition the lack of tolerance related to other people's point of view. So pleading for tolerance is really another way of pleading against polarization.
Thank you both so much. Now we will kind of transition into Q&A.
Hi. So I'm Jackson Baker. I'm not a student here. This is my fiance. She is a student here, and she got us tickets. And I wanted to say that I think maybe during the first section we've had a little bit of equivocation going on when we talk about good between moral epistemology and moral ontology. So the question that I want to ask is, rather than phrasing it, does God need to exist for morality to exist? Because morality obviously exists. Maybe asking the question, does God need to exist for goodness to actually be good instead of a matter of social convention? Like for it to actually be, for goodness to exist ontologically, as opposed to, for people to be good by knowing and then following social convention.
Yes. So when I pray in the morning, first thing, I pray to God as the source of the good. And in ancient philosophy, there are two ways to think about that. One is Platonic and one is Aristotelian. So Plato thought of the good as coming out of God. And Aristotle thought of the good as returning to God, going in the opposite direction. So there are two directions here in which God is involved in the good. I don't think we can define good because of what in philosophy is called the naturalistic fallacy. I'm not going to go into that, but we can say this is norm expressivism, that to say that something is good is to say I am drawn by it and I endorse being drawn by it. And in my view, what is finally good in that sense of what draws me and deserves to draw me is God. So Augustine says at the beginning of Confessions, he says, our hearts are restless until they rest in you, until they rest in God.
I do not think there was much equivocation in the exchange. What I think is happening is John and I have very different views about goodness. For me, goodness is, in a sense, just what we recognize as good, just like testy. Being testy is not something that things have independently of human beings. You need people to like the food for something to be tasty, to have, to be pleasant to eat. I think the same is true of of goodness. It's really defined by our reaction to the world. Our reactions come first. So for me, this is the end of the discussion. This is what goodness really is. John, of course, agrees with some of the way of thinking about moral statement, but he thinks the ontology is very different. He wants to be he's a realist about goodness. So that's really, I'm not quite sure I would call that an equivocation. It is just we have different perspectives on the nature of goodness. So that makes some of the questions then a little bit ambiguous, so to speak, when we try to answer them. Yeah.
Thank you. So Dr. Machery alluded to like psychological and scientific reasons against the existence of God. I was wondering if beyond the utility of belief in God, if we could have some discussion on reasons for and against God actually existing. Thank you.
I'm happy to start there. I wouldn't want to say that there are scientific reasons against the existence of God. That's not quite the way I would put it. What I would want to say is that we have scientific explanations for why people believe in God, and that makes God superfluous. Now, once you understand why people believe in something, it seems that there is no need to assume that there is a God to explain why people have such a belief. What do I have in mind? There are two types of explanation usually provided by cognitive scientists. One appeals to the notion of a byproduct. And that's the idea that the belief in God is just a consequence, an accidental consequence, so you might say, of the way we understand the world around us in our everyday life. So one thing that's very common, for example, is that when we see an event that's unusual, something that captures our attention, something we did not expect, often we view that event as the consequence of an intention, as expressing someone's intention. Right? Something happens to you, something that you did not expect, something that concerns you, matters to you. You're interpreting that as being the expression of agency. An agent did that. And according to many cognitive scientists, this intuitive disposition are the source of, at least not, of course, sophisticated understanding of God, but a sense that there is more to our to life than just what we can see. Right? So that's a very simple toy example, but that's one form of explanation for why many people experience all over the world something that seems to go beyond what they can see with their eyes. Right? Another form of explanation move away from the idea of byproduct, but focuses on the idea of function. And the idea is that religious beliefs have a function. They serve they do something either for the individual or more commonly for the society of believers. Right? One important idea was formulated by the anthropologist and psychologist Hare in his nice book called Big Gods, which is the idea that, and that actually fits with some of the things that John was saying, that for human beings, it's very tempting to favor themselves rather than favor the greater good. And we live in part because we have this tendency to be egoistic. One solution to that challenge is a belief in a God that sees what we are doing and that punishes us for what we are doing. They're called big gods, omnipotent, omniscient gods. And the idea is that the belief in God evolved as a solution to altruism, to cooperation, to make human beings altruistic and cooperative. So different form of explanation. Right? The first one says belief in God is a byproduct of our intuitive understanding of the world. The second one says belief in God has a function for society, including maybe allowing us to be cooperative, to help one another in very large societies. It's a very different type of explanation. I think they can be combined in interesting ways.
Could I say something about that? I don't want to take more than my share of the time. But the first sometimes called promiscuous teleology. So, I mean, that why are rocks pointy? Because they don't want to be sat upon. You know, that's a sort of, we attribute agency all over the place where it isn't. But if that is natural to us, then, and now I'm using Justin Barrett's argument here, that would be just what God would use. It fits our nature that we have this natural tendency to attribute agency. As to the second, the fact that belief has a function doesn't show that it's an illusion. You know, water has a function. we need water. We get thirsty. That doesn't show that water is an illusion. And maybe this thirst for God is like that. We have the thirst because there is, in fact, something to supply it.
John is right about both points. However, the claim is not so much that it shows that the function of a belief shows that the belief is false or an illusion. The claim is that it might you might have an explanation for why people hold the beliefs that do not require postulating the truth of the belief. Right. So often, you know, we see beliefs that people hold, and they could hold these beliefs because they've learned something about the world. So the truth of the belief explains why they hold that belief. But another explanation is that's what they've been told. This is what their culture tells. And once you have this other explanation, you don't need to postulate that the belief is true in order to explain why people have such a belief. So I surely wouldn't want to move from has a function to being false. That would be a fallacy. I do think if we can provide an explanation for why people hold a belief, then we might be undermining the need for postulating or weakening the need for postulating that the belief is true.
So I would ask then the presupposition that somehow this is a generated idea, right? Going to the very beginnings of, you know, human history. In that sense, right, humanity develops this idea in your theory, and someone starts talking about God. There has to be a prime source for this. There has to be a moment of origin. And so because of that moment of origin, I ask the question then, what is the prime source? What moves that in? Because I don't think that humanity on its own could develop the idea of God. I think it would have to be from the outside in which it is imposed. I mean, humanity as a singular entity is a source, right? Or it's a singular entity. And it could not create that new idea of something that is outside of it without something acting upon that. Sort of a metaphysical or a physics-based way of saying, you know, every action has an equal and opposite reaction to it. So how would you say, how would either of you say that came about? Because I feel like there has to be a prime mover here. Because otherwise, the assertion that God comes from nothing is just, it doesn't seem like it makes much sense to me. Or if it comes from an imagination.
Do you believe in vampires? Do you believe in vampires? So surely, this vampire is it's a figment of our imagination. That's actually quite common, in fact, in many different cultures. And surely, human beings didn't need vampires to start believing in vampires. So just imagine vampires.
So I agree with you that somebody has to start it off, and it's not quite clear who that would be. In ancient Greece, there was a sophist called Critias, and he said some ruler got worried that people weren't obeying his rules in secret, and so he invented God, because God could see what we do in secret and punish us. But the idea that a single person could sort of hoodwink millions and millions and millions of people in that way seems implausible to me. But I guess there's an underlying point here, which is suppose that there's a scientific explanation. There's also a theological explanation, perhaps of the very same phenomena. And in general, I don't think that the scientists, including the evolutionary psychologists, should be telling us whether it's rational to believe in God or not. And I don't think the theologians should be telling us about the structure of the human brain, or there's a phrase, non-overlapping magisteria here, which with some qualification I think I want to accept. That's Stephen Jay Gould's idea, that we have different functions. These different disciplines have different functions. We shouldn't try to take over each other's territory.
So two quick things, very short points. I think it's not quite the right way to think about invention as one person inventing a belief in God. Many beliefs keep popping throughout the world all the time. And this is the same idea here. It's a very natural thing to think about. Ghosts are found, the belief in ghosts are found in an incredible number of culture. Because it's a very natural way of understanding things you don't quite understand, and so on and so forth, right? So there's not a prime mover, there's not one person. It's a very natural way of understanding the world. So that's why somehow the problem is somewhat circumvented. Now, with respect to the magisterium question, yes and no. It's often the case that science has very little to say about humanities. But I do think it's often the case that we need to update our understanding of the world in light of our discoveries about human beings and human nature. So I tend to be somewhat resistant, unsurprisingly, I would think, of the ideas that we have magisteria that are independent from one another. I don't think scientists are in the business of telling us what we should believe, but I think we philosophers are in the business of listening to scientists and trying to find out what it means for the way we ought to have a life.
So this is a very deep topic today, and actually it reminds me of something in mathematics called fractal. The deeper you go, you're going to see the deeper to deep, endless. And also, since it's a broad topic, I would like to select a point I want to go into, which is the last gentleman. What last gentleman was asking actually had a very deep meaning of that. So I'm a fan of Kant. It's my favorite, one of the favorite philosophers, and the other one is David Hume. And together with another guy, mathematician, his name is Golo. In 20th century or 20th century, I think it's later than Karl Marx. If Karl Marx is 50 years later, he's going to modify his theory. So that gentleman asked, I think I can change a little bit different to ask, to state that. That is, the human reason never go beyond human experience. So if humans have no experience about God and everything associated to that, how do humans raise this concept or anything that related to that, right? So I think the very, very deep thing here today, because I really want to challenge Professor Machery, and I'm sorry, forgot the name. I checked the poster many times, but I'm very sorry for that. I'm actually standing with Professor Hare about this. So you mentioned that people just naturally get this idea. But what does this naturally mean? What the word naturally mean? Will things emerge from nature? So you know, there are many things, because I read some book about the complex system. You know, science are making a lot of progress today. There are always two different understanding systems of a scientific system. One is people think that everything can be reduced into some very simple concept, and some think the complex system, they're all emerged. If something occurs naturally, there would be something even deeper thing behind. that may be coming from the self-reference of the whole system. They're waiting for people to dig. And in this circumstance, would you still call it's the natural thing that people think God exists? Or it actually has some very deeper thing behind it?
So by natural, I just mean a very simple thing, which is there are ways of understanding the world that are rooted in human nature. We are part of the same species. We have a few hundreds of thousand years of evolution since Homo sapiens emerged, and millions of years since the form of Homo evolved. And this very long history, both as Homo sapiens and as other species before Homo sapiens, has shaped the way we human beings as a species understand the world around us. Exactly like it is natural for a spider to weave its net, exactly like it is natural for a dog to bark. This is the expression of centuries, in fact, millenaries, in fact, even a longer history of selection that has led, in their case, to very simple behavior. In our case, to a way of grasping and making sense of the world around us. This is what I mean by natural. There's nothing really mysterious here. Now, I really enjoy the point made by Justin Barrett that you reported earlier. This is a clever point. And one that I don't have any rebuttal. I think this is indeed a possibility, an interesting idea. But I think there's nothing mysterious in thinking that either some behaviors or some habits in the way we're making sense of the world are the consequence in the way the mind has evolved over eons.
Maybe just a word about natural. It's a very hard word. In the three Abrahamic faiths, so in Judaism and Christianity and Islam, there have been a tension, the same tension in all three religions. I think this shows that it's really one family. A tension between thinking that we can deduce morality from human nature, and on the other hand, that human nature is divided, mixed, so that there's something might be natural to us and still not good. So I'm pre-diabetic, and fatty sweet food. Probably, from the Pleistocene, probably it had adaptive value, but for me it's a disaster. So it's, you can't deduce from nature what it is that we ought to do, right and wrong.
This is for Dr. Machery. So fairly early on, you mentioned that you consider yourself a relativist, and if I'm understanding this correctly, this means that there are no moral absolutes. You also said you're an empiricist who cares about practical things. And so I ask you, practically, how does relativism reconcile with your experience when you see other people going about their moral systems that is just contrary to your own?
That's an excellent question. It goes both ways. I mean, that's really a difficult question. It goes both ways. I mean, being a relativist has led me to tolerate a large number of different outlooks on the world, different perspectives that people might have about what matters, what should be valued, and try to has led me to not impose my own perspective and values on other perspective and values. So that's one side of the coin. Of course, there are limits to that kind of views because there are moral outlooks that I find aberrant from my own moral outlook, right? Not from an absolute point of view, but from my own moral outlook. There are things in the ways of behaving, ways of choosing what matters, ways of valuing things that I just find unacceptable. And I wouldn't want to live with people with this kind of perspectives. So, and I don't think they're wrong. I just think they have a moral perspective that is incompatible with mine. And I do not want to live with them or among them. So to the extent that I can, I would try to avoid personally sharing a space with those people. So there's, I was talking about tolerance, and that's the first side of the coin. But tolerance, as anyone who has thought for a minute about tolerance, quickly, meets its limits, right? When you're going to find people who are intolerant or people who want to end tolerance, that kind of things. We have a very similar issues there where there are limitations, there are limits to, in a sense, the principle of tolerance that as a relativist, I'm willing to embrace. But it's not incompatible with relativism, because I'm not saying these people are wrong. I'm saying that their moral perspective is unacceptable to me.
Hello. Oh, hi. So I kind of had a question sort of building off of that same one about your example about like growing up in Germany in like the 1920s. So previously to that, you're saying that like everyday morality comes very easily to most people. So what is your take on someone who did grow up in Germany in the 1920s where it would seem to be very difficult to not be a Nazi? And then also, is that if they are and like do believe those, does that mean that they are, I don't know, like not as morally responsible maybe? Just kind of like what you would do about like a situation in which someone's moral views are intolerable to the point where most people would consider needing like intervention, I guess.
Good. So two things. There's the issue of of moral responsibility in the face of the role of luck in our behavior. That's one difficult question that you're asking me right now. I'm sure John has thought about that as well. The first question about what to think of Germans in the 1920s or 1930s, I should say some Germans stood, of course, against Nazis. It's worth remembering. Not everyone embrace Hitler's views. It's an interesting question. In many ways, I want to say two things at the same time. Those people were perfectly moral, the Nazis. Why? Because they were behaving according to their own moral perspective, right? So they were expressing their own moral commitments. From my perspective, what they were doing was wrong, right? So the two are compatible, right? I wouldn't want to say that absolutely what they were doing was wrong, because I don't believe there is such a thing as absolute wrongness. What there is from my perspective, they're violating my commitments. From their perspective, they are following their own commitments. This is a place where it relates to the previous question, right? I see a moral outlook which I find abhorrent and repugnant, right? But I'm not claiming that it's absolutely abhorrent and repugnant. I'm just telling you, given what I'm committed to, what they are committed to is deeply, deeply repugnant. Now, with respect to your second question about, the second part of your question about responsibility, such a difficult question. I think John will say they are responsible because they could have done differently. I tend to have a slightly different view. In fact, I do believe that if they are responsible, it is not because they could have done differently. It's that we need another view of responsibility that does not hang on this idea of being able to do something different. So on my view, there's, and in contrast to Kant's view, responsibility does not depend at all on this idea of, and they could have done something different, and they could have behaved something different. It comes to the expression of who they really are. Those Nazis were deeply committed to their views, and they were expressing their values and their behavior. That is the ground for responsibility, right? So luck is not incompatible with responsibility. If you understand that responsibility does not relate to this capacity to do otherwise, but to the expression of who you really are. So that's a little bit of a philosophical answer, and I'd be happy to talk more to you about that. So you need to rethink the way you're thinking about responsibility. So that's my answer.
Yeah, here's another place where we disagree quite strongly. I think that killing millions of Jews is wrong.
So do I?
Well, I think it's not just that I don't like it and that I don't want to live with people like that. I think that it would be wrong even if I didn't think that way. So I mean, we should think of responsibility, I think, as requiring capacity. So this is what Kant puts by saying ought implies can. I'll just end. It's 7 o'clock. I have to stop. When I was working in Congress, I took my young daughter to the office, and she peed all over his rug, all over the congressman's rug, and I mean, she wasn't in control of her bladder, and I should not have rebuked her because it wasn't her fault. We only rebuke people, we only hold people accountable for standards that they are able to reach.